Okay, guys, we're going to continue to investigate polynomials. So I'm going to give you guys just a quick run through of some extra terminology for our polynomial graph here. So if we take a look at this graph, you guys are going to see that my first question here is what's the minimum value of this graph? So I'm going to zoom out a little so we can see the whole picture, and you're going to see that the lowest point on this graph is going to be down here. So the furthest it reaches in the negative direction would be, here's my negative 30, so negative 31 and negative 32. Okay, so I would say the minimum value would be negative 32. Okay, now if I wanted to ask how many minimums does this graph contain, I want you to go back and think about your parabola land, okay? When you had a parabola, you had a picture that just looked like y equals x squared, and when you were talking about maximums and minimums, we would have a picture like this, and your minimum value would be the only minimum on the picture. But here, if you look, you're going to notice that this graph actually has more than one minimum, right? If you look here, you're going to notice that we have a minimum here and another minimum here. Okay, so we have a way to distinguish between the two minimums. Okay, this minimum is not the absolute minimum because it's not the lowest minimum on the whole graph. So the name we call this is a relative minimum. Okay, whereas this minimum is literally the lowest point this graph will ever reach. So we would call that an absolute minimum. So my absolute minimum here, if I wanted to know how low does my graph go, I would say the absolute minimum value it reaches would be like negative 32. Whereas here, a place where I'm reaching a minimum would be 0. Now, the thing we want to be careful with is we want to make sure that we can also apply this idea to maximums. So this graph, notice that the arrows are going on forever here. So it's always growing and growing. So there is no absolute maximum because it's reaching up to positive infinity. However, there is a maximum here. You see we have this turning point. So we would call this a relative maximum. Okay? So when you go and log into Delta Math, they're going to ask you a couple questions about that, and that's the vocab you need. And we'll clean that up on Monday. All right, guys, have a great weekend. Thanks.